Sometimes you're just lucky or unlucky with timing. We thought we had validated everything we needed, and the investors were just not there.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ananja, and you're listening to the Oil and Gas Baking by Show. Today, I'm happy and excited because we'll be joined by Jason Ethier, who is the founder and CEO of Energy Tech Cypher. He has worked with more than 600 climate tech founders, advising them on fundraising and commercialization. Today's conversation is about climate technology, energy infrastructure, and how the capital gets deployed in this industry. Also, we talk about some of the biases on how innovations get adopted and scaled. So with that, let's deep dive into Jason's journey and also get his views on the biases that might exist in this energy industry. Jason, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me here. Excited to share my journey.
I was looking into your journey is very interesting. Like you have worked with the startups, so you have advised many startups. You have worked with the energy technology, climate tech technology. So it's a lot to learn from your journey. But I'm a little bit curious, like
Mm.
what brought you in this climate tech technology world, and what you have learned and what you have seen differently.
Yeah. I think sometimes with startups, you don't really know you're an entrepreneur until you do it and you want to do it multiple times. And I fell into entrepreneurship, starting a company, working on engine technology right out of school. And it was exciting to work on something new and different. And we started this business, and it's buried in history books. I'm not going to name it, but we started it, got some seed funding for it, and the business collapsed in like 3 months. Part of that was a team issue. Part of it was the technology just didn't have product market fit, but I really enjoyed working on something that felt new and different and was really pushing the edge of what we could engineer. I ultimately moved to Boston, Massachusetts, looking for my peer group actually, and trying to find all these people working on climate and hard tech. And that was around 2011. And as I talked to some investors and people in the space, I actually got feedback. Climate tech is dead. This was 2011. In the US, there was a number of massive failures in what we call climate tech 1.0. People said, brand yourself as an energy company, talk about these other things. But that didn't deter me. I wanted to work on technologies that reduced emissions or just made energy more reliable and more sustainable, and had the benefit of falling into a great group of founders who ultimately started an incubator called Greentown Labs while I was also building my gas turbine business, Dynamo Micropower. I never really looked back. It was just a lot of fun being in the hot seat. And I couldn't imagine a different career because I never had a different career. So I've really been doing this since the beginning. Yeah.
And now you're shaping many other founders, so many other startups. So that journey continues. But you
Yeah.
already mentioned about your own startup called Dynamo Micropower. What did you learn building that business?
Yeah, I learned the oil industry is tough to commercialize in, and I also learned about a lot about how energy gets made in the U.S. It's kind of funny to think like, this was 15 years ago that we were really starting out, and there were a few things that were new. People were just starting to talk about things like the lean business model canvas. They were just starting to talk about lean startups and applying that to hard tech. And in the energy industry, we were just starting the shale revolution. And I remember coming to an SPE conference, I think in 2013, and they were talking a lot about fracking gas wells, and they were starting to frack, wet wells that had more liquids and condensates. And it was amazing to kind of sit in this position with all these really intense technologists who were sharing information about how do we get better at extracting natural resources. And it was amazing to me how in the weeds, engineers were about extracting things better. And it really made me appreciate how difficult it was to pull oil out of the ground. And I think, as someone who grew up on the East Coast and was really far away from energy generation. I think my impression at the time was you literally just stick a straw in the ground and the oil comes out. It's a lot of work. You know how much work it is.
I
Um,
know.
and and that brought me to the oil field. And the way we learned about what people needed and wanted is we went to the Permian, went out to Midland, visited people out in the field. I've been out to the Bakken in North Dakota and understood what people needed when it came to power generation. And it was cold. It was like negative 40 degrees in the Bakken and plus 40 centigrade when we were in the Permian. And you realize, when you build products for this space, they really have to kind of span the different fields. But we were
Yes.
at a time and place where it was exciting because everything was changing, both in terms of how people produced oil, how they learned about deploying capital, like just the way the oil industry deployed capital changed so quickly. And so there were a lot of lessons there, which taught me how hard it was to go off and build a new technology. And I could easily dig into that and spend a whole hour talking about the challenges of commercialization for new technologies.
Very interesting. And but that gives you an opportunity to see this industry very close and to see what works, what doesn't work. But my next question is related to commercialization of the technology. What is the biggest challenge for commercialization, and why some technology get scale and some fail to scale?
Yeah. I think there's always a push and pull with new technologies. And when you think about industry and especially in an industry like the oil industry, there's not a lot of people just sitting around looking for new things to try. Things have to work. It's not just trying. Like they really have to be deployed and be reliable because the whole energy supply chain kind of relies on it. People's lives rely on something being safe. And so when we introduced our first product, I think people liked the value proposition. They liked what it could do for them. But they also looked at us as a gaggle of four kids, and we were young, and said, like, how are you going to support me when things are cold, when things don't work? And we didn't set up our business to be capitalized well enough
Mhm.
to support the customer. And when you have a new technology, there's the core of what's new, your new tech that enables something to be different. But you really have these like onion or like the layers of an onion. You have these different layers that make a product work. And that includes the package it goes in, it includes the service you wrap around, it includes warranty. And that was for a simple product like ours that was $100,000. You still kind of need all this stuff to make a customer successful. And we didn't know that going in on the first time. And that really slowed us down, and it really made me underestimate how well capitalized the business needed to be. That affects the returns that you
Uh-huh,
give to
uh-huh.
potential investors,
Yes.
and that was something we had to learn the hard way. So one is, you know, people in industry, people in energy require something that's more comprehensive, in part because there are fewer people, in part because they honestly are really good at managing things today because they're so technical. And so the expectations for a product need to be higher. And maybe the fourth thing is regulation is very firm, right? And if you're in an operating environment and you have to deal with limited amounts of flare being produced or safety requirements, a new product and a new service needs to include all of that because the operator's not able to put their own skin on the line.
Yes,
They
right.
have to be successful. And even though you might be able to save them $10 million, the cost of failure might be more. That's the kind of context you have to live in. So I think capitalization matters in terms of being able to show up with an end user and say, yes, our product's going to save you money here, but we're going to be able to provide you all these other things that you're used to. And as a new technology provider, doesn't mean you have to do it. You can show up with partners who can do it. So existing OFS companies or other service companies can provide that as part of a broader team. One aspect is coming in too early. I think the other aspect is a product really has to deliver real value. And I think sometimes, with these highly technical solutions, they might be able to, bring in a new chemistry or a new process, but the complexity of system that you fit into ends up being much more sophisticated than I ever expected and learned firsthand. And we find a lot of successful companies do have someone in leadership with 15, 20 plus years of experience because they know how to navigate, they know how to articulate the value, and they know how to translate that back to a product team. And that's again, like, how do you define the whole system that works? And some projects don't get funded, and that's fine. The value wasn't there, and you want to discover that kind of early in the process.
Makes sense. Like I have a couple of questions. I will
Sure.
go into those ones, but I'm trying to understand. So when you built that Dynamo micropower, what was the toughest part to get a capital into the business or selling to the customer? Like I understand the other aspect
Yeah.
of the technology, like you have to cover the whole value chain, so the customer or end user can feel comfortable using that technology. But if you have to pick one out of two, commercialization or capitalization, what was the biggest challenge?
Yeah, I think with one of the things I learned was sometimes you're just lucky or unlucky with timing. And when we really had honed in on the industry, we had identified customers in North Dakota. We actually had commitments for about 100 units, which would have been about a $10 million book order. And we started to line up capital to build our first production run. And we were closing on that capital in the summer of 2016.
Mhm.
And if people remember, in North Dakota specifically, we started to hit this point where there was an oversupply of oil in the market in terms of the market to WTI, but it
Yeah.
was like $110 a barrel. And in like 2.5 months, it had dropped at like $80 to $30 to
Mhm.
$40. And
Yeah.
what ended up happening is this was one of the quickest drops that people had seen in recent history
Right.
because shale was so new. And the magic of a shale well was you could drill it, produce it, and have it pay for itself in about a year. And the industry was kind of used to these Gulf of Mexico productions where,
Yes.
you bring a lot of capacity online, but it was predictable. And so the whole industry froze, like all the capital froze. And we lost customers because our customers didn't know, what their run rate was because they were going from looking like they were generating a lot of margin to one where maybe they just had to eke along. And so drilling programs collapsed. Our champions literally lost their jobs because the downsizing just hit
Yes.
everyone so hard. And so we went from an order book of 100 down to we don't even know who the customers are anymore because the teams had all changed. I don't
Yes.
think I could have predicted that, but what that translated to, which was really hard to predict, was the capital markets. A lot of the venture firms in this space reserved capital for existing investments, and the same with private equity. And we saw basically a shortage of capital across the ecosystem for the next 5 or 6 years because people had already tied up so much capital into existing smaller shale companies who are trying to prove reserves and then their service companies. So the twofold is one, when the time's right, you got to pull in the money because you want to build and deploy quickly. But you're really at the whim of these capital forces that you really have no control over. And sometimes being an entrepreneur is being at the right time and place. And we had the right product and just really just wrong timing. And that happened to us a couple times. So it gives you a humility that you really can't control everything.
Right.
And to go back to your original question, it was a challenge for us to raise capital. We thought we had validated everything we needed, and the investors were just not there. And so we couldn't build the whole thing.
Mhm.
We did scrape together maybe a tenth, 10% of the capital I thought we would actually need to go off and build a proper business because I'll be honest, I wanted to build this product. I really thought it needed to be in the world. And so we built the product on a really skinny budget and we did get an MVP out in the market. And and I think we made too many compromises around along the way. Like
Mhm.
we were not able to build the support. We were not able to really test things as much as we want. And we had customers who took a risk with us because they really wanted the product in hand. And I remember when we shipped our first product into North Dakota, everything worked on our technology. We deployed it, and it was going into a winter weather where it was negative 40 degrees. And the system that we had a failure on the unit where it shut down, I think within 48 hours of running. And it was a fan we had installed that was cooling a bunch of our system, and it was rated on the spec sheet. It said negative 40, like it should work. Um, and you deploy it and go, what we had tested this in a negative 20 environment. Why isn't this running? And it's not the things that you would expect. And I
Yes.
didn't have a spare of that part
Yeah.
on inventory. And the replacement was going to take 4 weeks to come back. And that really kills the customer experience, even though
Yes.
it wasn't a core piece of our new technology. It was this whole system that really prevented the whole thing from working, and we weren't able to provide the support they expected. So they shipped it back. And that was an unfortunate first touch with the end user, and in a lesson in people need to operate. So they're just going to do that.
Actually, it's a learning for everyone. So when our
Yeah.
customer is buying a solution and not the
Yep.
one component, not one product. So whoever is providing that solution, as in your case, like the fan has changed the game altogether. If the fan was tested and the way it was set on the sheet, the things could have been different. And
Yeah.
that also brings my next question. Like, do you think because of that, energy industry is biased towards the new technology because they'll always like to use proven technology? How was your experience?
Yeah, I think, because it's a technical buyer, they really like technology. I think with a lot of engineers and a lot of technical folks, they like to understand how things work. They're very interested in what's coming, and they're just constrained by the fact that they have to make things work.
Mhm.
And when I say, it has to work, like our system was powering critical power equipment, and if we were not running, they were not meeting the safety regulations around critical power. And the right call was to send the product back, and I'm not gonna fault the customer for that. And they're high standards in part, because a lot of regulation sometimes is written in blood.
Yes.
But I wouldn't say they're afraid of technology because they don't want to touch it. They just have very high mission requirements, and that gives you a different mindset where you have to control risk. And be it a $1 billion Gulf of Mexico project or even a smaller shale well, the regulations still matter. And I think a lot of our industry is driven by regulation.
Yes.
Um, the current administration in the U.S. has obviously loosened some regulations, and that's going to drive kind of the decision making. And I assume when a new administration comes in, that'll change things all again. We're starting to see a lot of concern about the supply of water in industry, and we're starting to hear from producers they don't pay a lot for water today. They have a metric for what the cost of water is now, but with supply constraint coming in from data centers, that's going to affect their ability to get treat water at the same cost, and they know there's a risk that they're going to have to meet a regulation. So they want to stay ahead of that technology coming in today. And I think a lot of the folks in energy technology are looking ahead, like what are going to be the big drivers of policy that will affect us to have to not just change like one oil well, it's an entire, lease holding that they have to think about.
Makes perfect sense. So we talked about the challenges from customer perspective, but when we talk about investors, how they pick winners versus losers, do they follow any process?
Yeah. I think it depends a lot on the investor. So one of the things that we teach entrepreneurs is you got to identify who's a lead investor and who's a following investor. And 90% of investors will follow, mostly because of time and because of experience. And people follow and jump in for different reasons. Usually in energy, you have a lot of these corporate venture capital firms. I would say most CVCs have to follow, not for technical reasons, but it creates a better dynamic for the business if they're not setting the terms of an investment. And a lot of times they will invest in a company because it does create operational improvement for their business. It will give new capabilities, and that's kind of enough for them to come in, especially if they have an internal champion who's really pulling for something. That's a different framework aside from is the company real? Is there going to be a return? Those CVCs get more return for the business than the equity they ever hold on the startup. So if
Yes.
there is that internal champion who really wants the technology, they'll figure out how to make it happen. For a financial investor, they're really looking for, is there a market outcome? Can I increase the value of my equity holding 10 to 50 times, depending on what stage they're coming in? And coming from their perspective, they actually don't they might have a thesis about the market and what's a good place to play. Like, is an oil and gas services business going to be good? But they'll never know as much as the entrepreneur about the the sales model, about if customers are truly buying, and so they're always looking for these indicators of if this is a real business. Is this going to turn into something that'll print cash? And I think the hardest thing about selling into energy is because you have to build so much of a product early on. It is hard to get validation to show your product and your business is going to be the one that wins. And especially in a market today where I was just at RPE, for example, and there may be, I don't know, a dozen companies all working on flare gas to methanol technologies. And the reason you do this is the gas is hard to compress and store.
Yes.
Methanol is a liquid. If you can make it a liquid, you can use the liquid transport supply chain to bring that to market. Um, I look at that and I go, okay, here are 12 companies doing the same thing. They all have a small reactor that looks like it can fit in a 40-foot shipping container. How do I pick the best one?
Yes.
And I think an investor will have to roll up their sleeves and kind of look at all of them and make a decision on which one of these is going to take the least amount of capital, has the best customer traction. And that's hard. You really have to be a specialist who can discern which of those businesses will be a winner. And you have to have a lot of conviction. And different companies have different ways of doing that in terms of their own diligence. But at the end of the day, they got to return, each company in the portfolio has to return 10x plus to the portfolio to make that bet worthwhile. And so it's a challenging bar to cross over.
And that's what I was going to say. It's very challenging.
Yeah.
And also, you mentioned about if the investor has skin in the game, that has more chances of success than the investors, which might be sitting on the side and they just deploy their capital. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want me to explore that a little more?
Yes. Yes. Please.
Yeah. So I think especially when investors are in a space, there is a lot of specialization. And if you look at who the investors' LPs are, that'll sometimes tell you what their interests are. And a lot of times the funds will tell you they have a certain premise. And you'll see in energy, there are certain funds that are set up specifically to cover like heritage or legacy businesses, and they're very specifically focused on like how do you support the energy business or the oil industry. You'll have so if a bunch of their limited partners are bigger energy companies or oil companies, they're clearly interested in investing in those kind of technologies.
Yes.
If the limited partners tend to be power generation companies, then it'll be more focused on the power generation side. I met a venture firm last week that has a specific focus on improving the usage and utilization of natural gas because their limited partners really want to help make sure there are technologies for clean natural gas in the market. And that's that kind of skin in the game. You're really servicing this other stakeholder who really is interested in the success of a technology or a platform. So that ends up actually being equally a good driver. And then the expertise of the specific individual at the firm matters a lot. They really understand what's going on within, upstream oil and gas. That are going to be in a position to understand if your technology is going to make a difference.
Makes perfect sense. And during that journey, you as a startup founder, and now you're working with all the companies, what are the biases, stereotypes you might have to unlearn
Mhm.
in your journey?
Yeah, especially as a I think most founders that we work with are technologists at heart, and they either come from a technical background where they're building a new widget, and they kind of fall like I had this problem too. You kind of fall in love with your solution. It's great for all these reasons, and you kind of fall into this trap where you think other people will see it and it'll be obvious. The funny thing is, if it was obvious, other people would see it, other people would do it. And you have new technology because you have an non-obvious way to view the world and you've built something. And you have to get out there and kind of teach the world about what you do. And the successful founders are ones who learn how to become marketers of themselves and their business. And I think especially when you come from a corporate world, you get used to talking about representing your company. And when you're in a startup, it's really just you. You and maybe the few people you pulled along, and we have to teach entrepreneurs to really start to insert themselves into the story about why they found this thing, why
Mhm.
they found it was novel, and how they're going to solve people's problems with a solution. And those are just kind of you have to like denaturalize people, so to speak, so they learn to become this jack of all trades who really talks about themselves. So that's number one. And then number two, when we teach them about how to raise capital, one of the things we have to teach them is that investors are not ATMs. Every investor is different. Every customer is different. And at the end of the day, you need to form a relationship and explain to people like how you fit their worldview. And as an engineer, I'm an engineer, like everything kind of, you want it to fit in a model, you want it to fit in a box, you want to generalize. And that's just not how people are. And so you kind of have to break down your own kind of assumptions about how you have to do business development essentially.
No, that's good. And so I have a follow up question on that one. Like, what's the biggest barrier to scale these kind of technologies? If you have to
Mhm.
underline one.
Yeah, I don't want to go back to capital because that always ends up
Yeah,
being the short answer. Having the right people matters a lot. And I think I mentioned it before when I started my last business. There was a bunch of us, we were kids, and we thought we could take on the world. And the reality is, having someone who has that deep experience, who really knows how to navigate and kind of pull the team through, is immensely valuable. And now that I'm a more experienced entrepreneur, bringing in people with 15 to 20 years experience is worth the cost. And when you can really get people on that journey with you, they can knock down doors. They have relationships in industry. One of the most interesting patterns to see is if you get someone on your team from Shell, Shell Energy has tons of alumni around the world. If you
yes.
have a Shell person on your team, you can get into any other energy company because they will find the other Shell alumni who will open doors for them. And I think that's true with other large businesses. Like you tap into those relationships and those skill sets, and putting that right team together can do more for the business than any amount of money can buy. And so finding those right people is super important. And you definitely see teams not make it when they're not necessarily putting the right team together that has understanding of the customer and the market.
I agree, and I talk to like lots of other founders during my day-to-day work, and when I see it's all about the team. Individual is great. Like individual came with the idea, he had a vision, But if you're right people in your board or the people who are helping to scale your business, that business will go far. And you already gave some of the examples. So I
Yeah.
fully agree what you just said, Jason.
Yeah.
And
Good.
just one thing to add here, like you are in Houston, and
Mm.
also you worked in different part of the US. How you see Houston is unique in that perspective with respect to energy business.
Yeah, happy to speak to that. So I'll go back to the start of my career when we moved up to Boston, and I went there to go because there was a lot of technology there, and it was very clear that the world outside of Houston doesn't really understand how energy gets made. Um, and it's not as visceral as it is when you're in the Houston ecosystem. And it felt very remote. And so when I came to Houston, not only do you get to meet kind of the roustabouts who are out there in the field, but a lot of the industry here includes people from all over the world who have had experiences that included field work, included being in environments where we didn't have the same kind of energy abundance we see elsewhere in the US. And so I think there's a lot of humility around the energy supply chain here where people understand what it means if we don't provide power and energy 24/7. And I think what we're seeing in the Middle East now with the closing of the Strait of Hormuz is that we in the US are seeing higher gas prices, but no one is seeing the power go out. No one is seeing the energy shortage. But we have members of our extended team who lose power at 8 p.m. because we work with people internationally. And I know folks in the international energy business see the effects of like what a weakened energy supply chain does because they work with those people or they come from all over the world. And and that's a long way of saying, an average Houstonian is not from Houston. Like they come, the energy industry brings the best and the brightest in and through Houston ecosystem. And I think there's a unique humility in this space where the people don't talk about themselves that much in Houston or in that well, but they have a deep appreciation for the work that gets done in power, in energy, in downstream materials because they realize like all the effort that was put together to create these massive systems that work pretty darn well. And that's something I've come to appreciate about Houston. The other thing about Houston that makes it interesting is it's a self-proclaimed energy capital of the world, and that's because you do have business leadership here. You do have technical leadership here. The right people can look at a technology and solution. You can kind of gather them around in one room pretty quickly and figure out if there's viability in a business or a concept. And I would encourage entrepreneurs who want to sell into energy go to Houston to go anywhere else globally. And when I was selling our initial products, I thought I would have to go to Minot, North Dakota, or go to Calgary, Canada, and the direction was no, go talk to the technical team and the business leadership in Houston. They're the ones who are going to vet this for us, and then push that back out to the fields themselves. And so, yes, you do have to work both, but people look to the Houston for leadership across those two domains in a way that I found unique from other cities.
And I found the same actually. As you know, like I work for ABB. So in our case, also, we cover sites, but also we talk to leaders in the headquarters.
Mm,
And I think you have to cover the whole value chain if you want to service these kind of big oil and gas customers.
yep.
And that also bring me to something like we talked about many things that founders should do. We talk about the capital, we talk about the team, we talk about the idea. Also, we talk about the timing of that idea. But if you have to advise something to them to make it big in this energy industry, what that would be one
Yeah.
advice?
Oh man, I feel like timing is the biggest driver. I think that one of the hard
And going back to timing, like the Dynamo Micro Power had that gas turbine. Do you think they might be doing much better now because of the power demand?
It's funny, like in retrospect, well, a year feels like a long time, but it's also not a lot of time in the energy industry. And there are times where I look at the past and I say, okay, if we were only 12 months earlier, we would have been in a different sales cycle. If we were only 12 months later, we could have made different decisions. And one of the big unknowns was we were entering the shale industry and everyone really wanted this product or they really needed a solution around power. And it kind of took us like an extra 6 to 9 months to figure out we really wanted to commit to that business and build a product around it. And the needs of the industry changed a lot aside from the actual financial market. And there was this thing that happened around 20, I think 17, where we went from a lot of individual well drilling where people were trying to lock up leases all across the industry to moving to multi-pad drilling. And I didn't come from the industry. I didn't know what that would mean. But we started to hear about that in 2016. And what happened is the needs for power changed. And so when I first went to market, I had a product. I thought a 50 kW system would work really well. Basically, within 18 months, the needs for power had gone to half a megawatt to a megawatt per
Mhm.
site because everyone realized the economics around multi-well drilling dominated over trying to grab leases. And hey, maybe if I was more experienced, I would have seen that coming. But that coupled with like the shortage of capital made it really hard to build the right product for the market. So my statement on that would be maybe if we were a year earlier, we would have come out to the right product in the market at the right time, and then would have gotten the customer feedback to build the bigger product sooner. So that's one lesson on timing. The other lesson on timing is I actually filed the bankruptcy filing for the company at the end of 2019. And that was, we were limping along and I finally decided to close up shop. And the weird thing that happened after COVID, maybe like 6 months, I think it was like mid 20, maybe early 21. If you had climate in your name, you could go SPAC a business and raise $100 million. And I don't think anyone predicted that, but we
No,
had
nobody
so,
knew
so
about
many
that.
energy businesses. And I'm thinking, man, if I only waited a year, we could have had all the money we needed to build the right product. I say that, but the market had moved on. So we would have built something different. But I think it's a lesson in, finance does drive a lot, but it's so hard to predict these kind of unknowns that you really got to like lean in and build a business that's authentic for your business in that moment because things can change so much in 6 months. I'll talk about a little bit about someone else here. I think one of the things that I think an entrepreneur needs to focus on is being authentic to their vision and mission. And as much as capital can dictate your ability to do the work, you really need to find the partners and investors that work for you. And I think one of the biggest companies we like to talk about here in Houston, Texas is Fervo Energy. They're doing
Yeah.
a lot of geothermal for data centers. I think when Tim was raising money, I don't think people were talking about data centers 4 years ago. It was not on the market. Maybe Tim knew because Tim got his first orders from, I think it was Facebook and then Google. And they were thinking about this problem. But when Tim was raising money, I talked to all the energy companies who are the traditional CVCs in Houston. And I asked them, are you doing geothermal? Are you interested in this? And we would always leave it off of the like technology roadmaps to look at because they were not looking at it. But there were these other businesses, smaller tier energy companies that were looking and deploying capital against it, just not the big super majors. And that was something we were blind to because that was when I was at Greenton, that was our primary customer, but it's kind of a lesson for, entrepreneurs. Like maybe it's not the big names that are going to be the ones that pull you through. It's going to be these other end users who really need the product. And it's going to be these smaller, still important and large oil companies, but they have a different strategy that doesn't necessarily match the super majors. And you got to find those financial partners who need what you build. And it's not always the traditional VCs. And that's really what I believe helped Fervo grow, is because he found those partners who could financially support him alongside the traditional VCs who really bought into his vision. And it was a little contrarian to what I understood at the time. And he's right because they've raised a lot of money and built a meaningful business.
And now they're going for IPO, and that's what I read.
Are they? I haven't heard that, but I'm glad. I'm not necessarily following them every day, but that's a huge achievement for anyone, and really good for the industry, to be honest.
Yeah, no, they're getting ready for IPO. That's what I read in the news. And we work with Fervo very closely.
Okay, good, good.
I know Fervo well. But when you talk about the timing, it's very hard to predict the
Yeah.
timing. Like we can think about it, what could have been done right, but sometimes you have to move on. But that also brings us to our rapid fire round, Jason.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Yeah. Go for it.
Okay, let's see. Biggest misconception in climate tech.
I think for entrepreneurs in climate tech, there is no premium for being a climate company in terms of the solution you bring together. I think at the end of the day, a climate solution has to be more reliable, it has to be more cost effective, and sustainability is a nice thing to have when two things are equal. But at the end of the day, because of the system you're fitting in is so complicated, there is not much of a green premium, and so you really have to hone in on what a customer needs to drive value. And generally, something that's more reliable and more cost effective is cleaner.
Makes sense. One belief about startups you disagree with.
I think one belief people have about startups is if you have something game changing, you can go off and raise money for it. We found It takes about 250 conversations for an entrepreneur to raise their first $1 million. And that's after they figure out that investors are not ATMs. And so it's really a slog, and you got to do it because you love it. You love the problem you're solving.
That's how you can continue on that idea. Otherwise you might go into different direction. Success won't come.
Yeah.
Technology versus market. What drives success?
Yeah. I think the market matters a lot in terms of your ability to attract capital to build a business. If you have a really good growing market, you can reinvest profits into growing your technology. But technology is what lets you stay in the game. And so I don't want to make a bifurcation. You can't have one without the other. That being said, I'm going to contradict myself. You can build a good services business without a lot of technology. It's just services businesses are worth, 1 to 2 times revenue, whereas a good technology business can be worth, 8 to 12 times. And so it's just much more intrinsically valuable for a venture investor. And unfortunately, if you land in the wrong market, you're going to be just stuck with a limited capitalization that you can pursue. So I think finding that market is very important, but having a command of a unique technology is what allows you to really capture value.
Makes sense. One habit that keeps you effective.
Getting enough sleep matters a lot for me. When I was younger, I could do an all-nighter occasionally, but nowadays, especially now that I'm in a position of leadership, if I don't get enough sleep, I get cranky. When I'm cranky in front of my team, and it affects them and their ability to work, and people pick up on it. So preserving that has become kind of more of a ritual for me. And unfortunately, I'm a late sleeper, so I tell my team no meetings before 10 a.m. I cannot do it because I will be cranky. We all need me to be in a good place. And it's funny because my co-founder is the opposite. She goes to bed at 9. I'm pretty sure I get emails from her at like 5:40 a.m. But you need to preserve that because it really affects your own performance.
Oh, makes sense. What is the most underestimated part of this transition?
Transitioning energy transition.
Yes.
I think the most underestimated part, which we're seeing right now actually, was how much electrification is going to dominate the conversation. And the headline today, in some ways, is that the grid is going to grow 4% a year every year, which doesn't sound like a large number, but it requires a lot of infrastructure, and that's being driven by a lot of the energy transition. When we think about load growth, it's not just data centers. Data centers is about 20 to 25% of the additions coming on the grid. It's all these other things. It's EVs. It's the electrification of everything, even to like frac pumps today, or some of them are electrified.
Yes.
That requires a different kind of infrastructure. And it's not just the fact that we have more power going into place. It's that the sources and loads are fundamentally different than they were before. Our power system was developed with centralized generation. And nowadays, because we've been developing solar technology and batteries, you actually have a lot of distributed nodes, and the power grid wasn't ready for that. And maybe all the power guys knew it, but I think a lot of us were taken unaware that the trends around energy transition has this other effect that means we got to build up our power side of our business as much as we transition to a variety of more fuel sources.
I agree with you. Just to add here, like lots of focus on generation, but the transmission and the grid stability is one of the most important topics. And sometimes it gets ignored into these discussions. So
Yeah.
as you said, we can talk about different source of energy, but we have to see like is our infrastructure ready to have this mix of energy resources. Yeah, one bias in startup investing you want to remove.
Yeah. There's bias that I think there's a couple of different biases. I think one of the things that's always challenging is software is always preferred for venture investors, and there's good reason. You can prove product market fit very easily, but one of the interesting biases is software companies actually take a lot of capital to reach exit. And depending on how you measure it, you need about 40 to $200 million to get to a position of exit. And the reality is the IPO market hasn't been there. So it actually still takes a lot of capital to build a software business. The bias is that hard tech requires more capital. It is true you need capital to kind of get to those proof points, but the reality is once you have a physical piece of asset, physical IP, your barriers to competition are a lot higher than software, and the amount of capital ends up being kind of comparable to an exit. And I think that's a challenging bias to overcome. Yes, the J curves are fundamentally different, but I think it's always funny to run into an investor who wants a capital efficient business and they keep investing in software. And I'm going, really? The software business still requires that amount because you have to buy customers at a certain level. And I think the proof are looking at examples like Uber and others where, a lot of that was a transfer of wealth of venture going into to really buy market share. And it's unclear that translated to the best return on equity. I say that and I didn't invest in any of them. So I'm not the professional and I didn't make all the money. But I just think it's like a weird thing that we have to, a bias we have to fight against. Is there
A-
is a capital efficient way to build a hard tech company.
And I also see that, like on software, everybody thinks like is a less capital and more return, and so
Yeah.
that's one bias that exists for long.
And one of the anecdotes I want to bring back is the opposite can be true. One of the biggest success stories of a hard tech company that really grew was I think it was Dell. Dell, they sold computers. It was 20 years ago. Yes, it was a consumer facing brand, but they were buying and assembling physical hardware. And one of the things they got really, really well was just managing cash flow. They collected customer orders up front. Yeah, they processed it online, but they were able to ship product to customers and pay vendors late, and that allowed them to grow a crazy amount because they had really strong cash discipline.
Hmm.
And one of the challenges in the energy industry is oil companies love to pay things net 180, which can really kill a business. But if you can come in and find those right partners and say, "Hey, look, I really need you to switch this around so that I can get you the product you need," you can turn a company that
Yes.
may traditionally be a cash sink into one that generates cash if you really can manage that customer relationship well. And that's part of how you become capital efficient is really the cash management. And that's where a really experienced CFO can come in and really change the game.
Makes perfect sense. And last not the least, complete this sentence. The future of energy depends upon who?
Oh, it depends upon, I guess the entrepreneurs, right? Developing new technology and not just bringing new products to market, but teaching the market about what can happen and what the future can be. And I think that's the thing we like to identify are these founders who do have a vision for where we're going to be in 10 to 15 years and makes it happen. And say what you will, I think one of Elon Musk's greatest strengths is he points out a world where we can be different, and maybe he doesn't hit every milestone, but we all buy into that world he's creating. And when
Yes.
you look back on where Tesla was, 10 or 15 years ago, I think we are in the world that he painted. And I think we want everyone who is working on energy technology to articulate where can we be, show us the path, and people will follow when they understand the risks and they understand really what that benefit can be. And, I'm sure we'll be talking about Tim Latimer the same way when his company goes off and changes the way we generate base power because he showed us a future that could happen and they made it happen.
Makes perfect sense. So we learned a lot in the short time, but we're coming to the end, Jason. So if somebody listened to this conversation after 5 years, what should they think differently about capital allocation, startups, and energy tech?
Yeah, I think there's always now is always the time to start your company. Now isn't always the time to scale your company. And we talked a lot about how timing matters. And I think that's true in energy. I think it's true in other industries. I think one of the quotes that Jensen Huang of NVIDIA is known to say is a lot of opportunity is being present, being there, and then taking the opportunity when it shows up. And that might be when the capital markets shift, it might be when the customers shift. But you always want to be working a little bit on your technology and trying to thread the needle to bring something to market. And then when the market's ready, it will tell you and it will pull you along. And you want to be in a position to say yes. You don't want to be on the front end. You don't want to be the laggard. And in my first business, I was definitely lagging the market when we should have been leading. And the only way to be in that position is to be there and be ready when the time is right. And then go in with both feet to really take your business and scale it up.
Makes sense. But as I said, like it's not easy
Not
to
easy.
the market now.
Yeah.
It's not easy.
Yeah.
So before I sign off, anything to add here, Jason?
Yeah, love supporting entrepreneurs and innovators. We're here in Houston, and we always have an open door policy. We have tons of events, and find it on Luma. Our company name is Energy Tech Cipher, and would love to see you come by, and I would love to see how we can help.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jason. We learned a lot about this startups, energy tech, energy industry, and the journey continues. So with that, I will sign off today. Keep listening Oil and Gas Breaking By show. See you next week. Thank you.